So my presentation is unlike what you'll see in a couple of seconds here, is actually titled From Margin to Center and Back Again, a history of TIC journals as a history of Marxist heresy in the Yugoslav context from 1952 to 1964. So I apologize because the working title ended up here, but I can do much about it right now. My presentation deals with the role of the TIC journals as a platform for radical Marxist intellectuals who criticize the theory and practice of a so-called real or existing socialism. To begin with, I'll provide a brief overview of 3 journals which emerged with intention to sparkle the controversies in the post-revolutionary Yugoslavia in a chronological order, because I believe that these journals constitute a common thread within anti-Stalinist socialist tradition. So let me start with some general information on these journals. The first one is the case of Pogledi, or The Views, which also had an interesting subtitle, a journal of theory of humanities and science, and it was published from 1952 to 1955. It was edited by a Croatian sociologist, Rudi Supek, who would later become a co-editor of probably the most notable case of Marxist humanist journal, the Praxis journal. And The Views are believed to be a direct predecessor of the Praxis philosophy as well as the journal. The second one is The New Thought, a literary journal published from 1953 to 1954. It was banned after it had published Anatomy of a Moral by Milovan Đilas, whom Zorana has just mentioned. And The Anatomy of a Moral was published in the first issue of The New Thought of 1954. And at that point, Đilas was a member of the New Thought's editorial board and one of the most powerful people in the country. The Anatomy of a Moral is considered to be an embryo of the new class, an analysis of the communist system, a monograph published in 1957, after which he was indicted and imprisoned. The fact that he publicly articulated disillusionment with the Yugoslav regime rendered him a first-class dissident in the eyes of the West. And what is more, the publication of the new class, as archival material suggests, was supported by the CIA and its proxies, such as the infamous Committee for Cultural Freedom. The next is, as I have already mentioned, Praxis, a philosophical journal, which was published from 1964 to 1974. From 1966 to 1974, it was edited by Rudi Supek's disciple, because Supek was his supervisor in his doctoral research, Gajo Petrović, and Rudi Supek himself. Praxis is considered to be a stronghold of non-dogmatic Marxism, or socialist/Marxist humanism, which is to say a left opposition to Stalinism both in Yugoslavia and abroad. And Praxis Group became quite influential because they also had an international edition, and its summer school, which took place at the island of Korčula in the Adriatic Sea. And this summer school and the journal Praxis marked this decade by gathering the most prominent both Marxist and non-Marxist philosophers of the time. For example, Erich Fromm, Lukács, Habermas, Goldman, Bauman, Leszek Kolakowski, Agnes Heller, thus rendering themselves the epicenter of the Marxist thought in the 60s and 70s. So here I need to elaborate on the concept I put in the title, the very notion of radical intelligentsia. This term arises as a useful category of analysis if you want to avoid the semantic burden of dissidents and opponents in this context. Namely, the problem with the term dissident, mostly in relation to Milovan Đilas, as the sociologist Mira Bogdanović pointed out, is twofold. Firstly, it can be applied only to anti-communists, not to the individuals who criticized the existing communist societies from a left-wing position. What is more, the term dissident conceals the fact that it was widely used by the CIA and its proxies to constrain workers and socialist organizing. Both Đilas and the Praxis group, whose predecessor is the journal Pogledi in terms of the structure of contributors, genre, and core values, considered themselves to be opponents in the sense that they contested the ruling party's politics, but not socialism as a notion. However, the political system of existing communist societies did not allow any forms of political opposition, though many forms of intellectual, cultural, and social revolt existed, as we can see. So, the terms such as dissidents or opponents do not describe properly the situation in which those radical intellectuals found themselves. Here, it is important to emphasize that while Đilas, due to his status of a dissident in the West, was widely embraced by the right-wing nationalist intellectual and political circles in the wake of the dissolution of Yugoslavia, the Praxis editors and the majority of its contributors remained faithful to the left-wing ideas and politics. In other words, they were resented both by party bureaucracy in Yugoslavia and later by the nationalist ideologues after its dissolution. So the term radical intelligentsia was formulated by Gerson Scher in his seminal work, Praxis and Marxist Humanism, which is his doctoral thesis published in 1978, where he asserts that thick journals became symbol and the battlefield of the radical intelligentsia. Moreover, the term intelligentsia, in comparison with the term intellectuals, which refers to a group of individuals, the term intelligentsia refers to a social stratum, which will be essential in Supek's work in Pogledi, or the already mentioned the views. Because Supek wrote about the role of the intellectuals as intellectual proletariat and their commitment to the working class cause and welfare in many essays and articles. He basically dealt with the position of a modern intellectual in a so-called existing socialism. Gerson Scher's main thesis is that the very emergence of every thick journal, including The Views, New Thought, and Praxis, as works of radical intellectuals, was some kind of a herald of novelties and significant changes in Yugoslav society. Well, I think here I can use a Gramscian metaphor of interregnum to depict the period and cultural climate in which both the views and the new thought emerged. Firstly, it was in 1952 that the Communist Party of Yugoslavia transformed into the League of Communists and introduced the notorious concept of self-management in economy, which was supposed to ensure workers' control over the means of production, which means to ensure democratic decision-making in the workplace. The old regime that was dying, to apply the Gramscian metaphor, was everything that resembled Soviet-style governance. The League of Communists declared its anti-bureaucratic and anti-Stalinist course by advocating for the freedom of expression and the struggle of opinions. The later, the notion of the struggle of opinions is also an essential category in Supek's works in the views. These unfulfilled democratic promises in the cultural sphere were, in Gramscian parlance, the new world which was trying to be born. Nonetheless, the case of Milovan Đilas and the banning of the new thought after having published Anatomy of a Moral, a documentary prose about the double ethical standards of the new class, the party bureaucracy, prove it remained just a proclamation. Additionally, it was in 1952 that Miroslav Krleža, one of the most remarkable Yugoslav authors, and at that point the secretary of the Yugoslav Academy of Science and Arts, gave a speech at the Third Congress of the League of Writers of Yugoslavia, in which he, jumping on the bandwagon of the anti-Soviet intellectual climate, following the Tito-Stalin split in 1946, reclaimed the idea of art for art's sake, which is obviously in stark contrast with the ideology of socialist realism, because socialist realism was the official cultural policy basically until then. So to fully understand and acknowledge the position of the views and the New Thought as thick journals and the struggle of opinions they initiated, we need to go back to what emerges as the original scene in this story. The so-called conflict on the literary left, which happened in 1939 and 1940, before the Second World War. So Krleža and his journal Pečat, Seal, probably the first thick journal in Yugoslav culture which criticized Communist Party of Yugoslavia from a left-wing perspective, stood in defense of so-called revisionists, those who opposed the dogma of dialectical materialism as a Stalinist falsification of historical materialism, which is to say, true Marxism. Also, Krleža and his collaborators defended the autonomy of literature and art, while those who adhered to the party advocated for the imposition of the socialist realism by all means. Đilas, who in the interwar period opposed Krleža's stance on dialectical materialism and socialist realism, regarded the conflict on the literary left in the following manner. He thought that the dispute between these two factions within the communist movement was not about the amount of freedom of expression and criticism each side considered to be enough, as he puts it, but about the strategy of the revolution. In other words, Đilas suggests that the debate on socialist realism, which will be remembered as the conflict on the literary left, was the final step in what he calls the Bolshevization of the party. Along with that, if we apply the Gerson Scher's thesis about the meaning of the genre of the thick journal in Yugoslav culture, we can conclude that the New Thought was initiated as a form of self-criticism of people who, just like Đilas, remained unrepentant revolutionaries, but highly critical of the post-revolutionary society and its hierarchy, which betrayed the pre-war ideals. And by self-criticism here, I mean their detachment from the official ideology and the official politics, but also their adherence to the struggle for socialism. So last but not least, Praxis was also an endeavor of intellectuals who firmly believed that the current regime betrayed revolutionary notions it was built upon. The launching of the Praxis in 1964 happened in the aftermath of the definitive victory over the dialectical materialism as a philosophical and scientific dogma, which resulted in the Praxis group being ostracized by the regime as revisionists and a false vanguard. And those labels, revisionism and false vanguardism, were also applied to those who Krleža defended, to those who defended the autonomy of art and who opposed the dogma of dialectical materialism in the interwar period. However, the Praxis group became quite influential across Europe, and it was on the conference on the Lake of Bled in 1960 that the group of philosophers and sociologists who would later become the members of the Praxis editorial board contested the party leadership on the question of dialectical materialism. However ostracized, they became quite influential in Marxist circle, in the academia, and among the students, both in Yugoslavia and across Europe. In addition, there is a vast consensus that the Praxis group and the pre-war revisionists had different means and methods in purely scientific and philosophical sense, but they shared the same goal: anti-Stalinist understanding of socialism. Also, the emergence of Praxis, basically a statement about short-lasting but still effective opposition to Stalinism, confirms the thesis that the genre of the thick journals signified a new happening in Yugoslav societies. In the end, let me just make a brief comparison between the views case and the New Thought. In a series of articles, which start with the article on the outdatedness of art for art's sake in 1953, Rudi Supek questions Krleža's position. Furthermore, he interprets the silence which followed Krlež's speech I have just mentioned as a symptom of the intellectual climate of fear which does not contest authority. He strongly implies that Yugoslav society remained Stalinist despite the anti-Soviet rhetoric. The path from margin to center is quite self-evident here, I think, because Krlež's position was marginalized in the interwar period, but he redeemed himself after the Tito-Stalin split. Also, Supek's position is at that point in the interregnum in 1953, the position of a minority, but the emergence of Praxis, a philosophical journal, will signify its return. And now I go to the case of Đilas and Nova Misao, and soon I'll be over. In Anatomy of a Moral in 1954, Đilas depicts Yugoslav political elite as a caste whose ethics undermines what they officially preach. Interestingly, in an article published in the same issue of the New Thought, he opposes Supek on Krleža regarding the art for art's sake issue. Đilas, however, also understands the silence on Krleža as a sign of a petty bourgeois mentality, but in the sense that he considers the Yugoslav cultural elite incapable of comprehending Krleža's significance and value. To sum up, I think main points could be phrased or recapped like this. So the first one is that it is in these thick journals that a terminology, the struggle of opinions, Marxist humanism, socialist humanism, historical versus dialectical materialism, which will intensify in the rhetoric of the 60s and of course in the rhetoric of the revolt in 1968, was forged. Secondly, these journals served not only as platforms for radical or subversive ideas, but also as a means of self-determination of the radical intelligentsia. And last but not least, those journals give us a profound insight how the certain terms and ideas previously marginalized became hegemonic and vice versa. And since I pretty much like being here, I'll misuse my privilege of chair of the panel to draw out a few more conclusions regarding the whole panel, and then I promise I'll give the floor to someone else and open the Q&A session. I think our timing is all right, so conclusions that can be drawn, I think, is that all of three presentations, despite different methods, microsociology, coupled with close reading, comparative analysis, or exploration of the genre, show that periodicals provide not only a platform for deliberately marginalized, subversive, and revolutionary ideas, but also space a space which radical intellectuals used as a means of self-determination. In other words, periodicals give us insights which are of indispensable value if we want to reconstruct the meaning of certain terms and phenomena such as feminism, avant-garde, anti-fascism, and Marxist humanism. Secondly, in the same way as we try to argue, these broad international ideas applied in local contexts enabled radical intellectuals to overcome their peripheral and subjugated positions, thus destabilizing the dichotomy of periphery and center, which fostered the oppression. Moreover, peripheral periodicals were much more than discursive sites on which big ideas were applied. Their very existence also embodied critical and subversive practices which shaped what later becomes known as avant-garde, Marxist humanism, and revolutionary anti-fascism. So thank you very much.